Potawatomi,
arts,
culture,
and entertainment.
This is a Pace production.
Warm welcome for Dr. Richard Warner.
Well, I like museums. I was going through Indiana a few years ago and stopped in this museum, and it had this really cool exhibit about Studebaker automobiles. Did you know Studebaker actually started out as a wagon maker? They were the only wagon maker that was successful in making the transition to making automobiles. And reflecting back on his success and the success of his company, John Studebaker said he really learned all he needed to know about life in Council Bluffs. I thought, well, how cool is that? Except, I kind of like reading some Council Bluffs history, and I had never heard that John Studebaker had lived in Council Bluffs, so I could hardly wait to get home and look into that. Well, when I did, I found out that he was actually only here 3 days. So he spent 3 days out of 80 plus years in Council Bluffs, and we changed his life. All of a sudden, this little shiver went through me. I thought, oh my gosh, what did we do to him? Well, what he wrote was that he decided he was going to join a wagon train, and he was going to go west to California and get rich. And he said back at that time, the journey to California was absolutely treacherous. There were just hundreds of miles of Great Plains. There were mountains. There were rivers. There were wild animals. There were storms. There was dust. There was pestilence. But the biggest obstacle on the trek to California was getting through Council Bluffs. Okay, fast forward 125 years. Springtime, 1977, Creighton University. I'm a graduate student, and I met Barb. We got married a few years later, and I was surprised. Barb grew up in Omaha, but she'd never been across the river. In fact, she only knew one thing about Council Bluffs. She said her father told her, don't ever go there. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm thinking this is going to be a big topic. We better dive in because we got a lot of ground to cover here tonight. And actually, growing up, I'd heard tales about how wild our town was, but I didn't buy into it. I figured every town has its wild side. Then I started studying a little bit about Council Bluffs history and learned we really were worse. We really were, as one early visitor put it, the poorest, meanest, dirty hole there ever was. Well, Studebaker started west in 1853. Who else came here in 1853? George Simons, right? So he started west with $65, a Bible, and 3 homemade suits. After visiting Council Bluffs and playing his first and last game of 3-card Monte, he continued the journey west with just 1 shirt and 50 cents. As he observed, Council Bluffs was a rather rough and tumble place at that time. Now, accomplices called cappers circulated amongst the travelers. And they were showing these fistful of money, and they said, there's no reason to go to California. You can win all the money you want right here from this town's helpless gamblers. These are the stupidest gamblers we've ever seen. And so Studebaker, now this is no dummy, he walked in and he watched, and he watched, and he saw people just winning money constantly. He didn't realize, of course, those were accomplices too. Well, he was worried the gamblers were going to run out. So he got his money out as fast as he could and got in that game. And I think you know how it came out. Well, he ended up going to California, but decided he'd learned his lesson. He's never going to gamble in any way again. So instead of going to the gold fields, he decided to build wagons and sell them to the miners going to the gold fields. He made some money, went back to Indiana, grew the wagon business, and eventually manufactured automobiles until 1966. So what was it like? Well, we had 1 saloon for every 217 people. Now, some people have said that that was the highest per capita rate in the United States. Now, I was unable to confirm that, but nonetheless, it does show us where our priorities were. Just out of curiosity, I Googled it. What is it today? Actually, it varies quite a bit from state to state. But if you're thinking 1 bar per 5,000, you'd be in the ballpark. So 1 per 200 people was definitely on the high side. Now, by that time, Council Bluffs had become a playground for some of the world's most notorious con men. And Canada Bill was among the best. I mean, he had this down to an art form. He walked with this shuffling, half-apologetic gait. And he had this good-natured, ear-to-ear grin, a squeaky, boyish voice, awkward manners, and a way of asking fool questions. In short, he came across like a complete idiot. And in fact, people with scruples wouldn't gamble with him because they thought it was like taking money from some poor special needs individual. But woe be it for those who decided to gamble with him, because Bill almost never lost. He was a pro, and his business was three-card Monte, and it was a business. He even wrote the general superintendent of the Union Pacific Railroad asking for exclusive franchise to conduct three-card Monte games on the transfer grounds. In return, he cut the railroad in for a slice of the action and promised not to swindle railroad employees or families. He would concentrate exclusively on traveling salesmen and Methodist preachers. Now, there has to be a story behind that somewhere. Now, Bill was so good at his pulling off a scam at his funeral. I was reading an article about his funeral, and they were just about to lower his coffin into the ground. And some of his fellow gamblers gathered around to pay their last respects. And at that final moment, one of the gamblers said to the others, "Hey, $50 says Bill ain't in the box." He couldn't get anybody to gamble with him. They said, "I'm not touching that. Bill's crafted fancier scams than this. No way, we're not going there." Well, basically at that time, Council Bluffs had a lot of people milling around because they're waiting for their wagons to be outfitted or meeting up with other parts of a wagon train here, or later on, waiting for railroad trains. So basically, you couldn't walk down the street without being bothered. It's sort of like walking through the Nebraska State Fair on a slow day, all of these vendors with everything. Iowa doesn't seem as bad, but Nebraska State Fair, I noticed that. And now, even if you did pass all of that, you're just by yourself, fellow travelers would come up and strike up a conversation because they're all in the same boat. And you get talking, you get to be friends, and they say, "Hey, why don't I'll buy you a beer." And so they'll go in, and generally the beers were drugged. If it was really drugged, they just out and out rob you. But more often than not, just get you a little not thinking clearly and lure you into a variety of rigged games. The atmosphere of the town was rowdy, to say the least. This taken from one of the passerby's diaries. The town is overrun by ruffians with a supreme fondness for liquor. They fight, create disturbances, gamble, and use indecent language. Well, what started as a two-story frame house for a Mormon family right in the center there, that two-story white building, became a boarding house, then a store, and later the United States Hotel, before being converted into the Ocean Wave Saloon. Now, we had a lot of saloons. What's so special about the Ocean Wave? Well, it said the tales of exciting times at the Ocean Wave were told around countless campfires all the way to California. It was said not only was every form of vice known to man available at the Ocean Wave, people insisted some types of vice were probably invented right there. It was that kind of place. There was a bowling alley, dancing girls, games of chance, up and running 24 hours a day. Now, of course, that sat right where the Broadway Methodist Church is today. And it said lightning had to strike twice, once figuratively, once literally, in order to transform that corner of First and Broadway from a sinkhole of sin into a sanctuary of salvation. Henry DeLong worked there. He worked as a capper while learning the faro trade from an experienced gambler, and he vowed to be the best gambler in town. He was very motivated. 1858, quiet evening. Henry didn't like quiet evenings. He was young, he wanted excitement. So some of his buddies decided, well, let's just hassle some Methodists. That's always fun. How can you go wrong with that? There was a Methodist revival meeting in town. And so what they did, they went to this revival meeting and encircled it. All of his buddies were around this campfire, just out in the periphery. And then Henry sneaked in really close. And the deal was, when he gave the signal, they were all just gone whooping and hollering and having a great time to disrupt that meeting. I mean, how fun a Saturday night is that? Well, the signal never came. History didn't record what the preacher said that night, but whatever it was, it struck Henry like a lightning bolt. He was converted on the spot. Then, 1891, a gigantic lightning bolt shot straight from the heavens, struck the Ocean Wave full force, and it died as it had lived in a spectacular drama, burned to the ground. It was said the onlookers either cheered or sobbed, depending upon their moral persuasion. And all over the West, gamblers and gold miners bowed their heads in silence when they heard the news. Well, Henry bought the land, and he worked very hard, including ran a laundry and some other things, a lot of hard labor, earned enough money, bought that land, and donated it for use at the Methodist Church. Now, Henry DeLong may have cleaned up the corner of First and Broadway, but that was just a drop in the bucket. That area between the brand new Broadway Methodist Church and the relatively new St. Peter's on Pierce Street was known as Rotten Row. That was the prime district to find the women of the town, and that stretch along the south side of the 100 block, likewise prime territory. Now, the brothels were big business and normally operated at a pretty low profile. Every now and then they'd pop into the newspaper, like up at the Ironclad one time, up on Rotten Row. Maggie Morse got into a skirmish with Jessie St. Clair, Jessie getting her hair well pulled and her nose tweaked in an argument over $2.50. And in a room above a saloon on Lower Broadway, Carrie screamed she was being murdered. So the proprietor broke through the door, and when he got in there, he found that Carrie was being given a severe thrashing by a woman wielding a crochet needle who claimed her husband was spending too much money at that sporting house. So there was news sometimes, but not all the places were rowdy. Ben Marks and his wife lived on Vine. Now, Mary was a very astute businesswoman, and her house of business was right next door. And this was no cheap run-of-the-mill house of ill repute. It was said her scarlet beauties were supported by Council Bluffs elite class only. Now, Mary herself was described as elegance personified, and actually a very refined, intelligent lady in all respects. She wore clothes from Europe and had a waxed and polished carriage driven by a uniformed horseman. In fact, I think some of the town's women, the society women, were actually a little envious of her. The story is told that one day the society ladies dropped into her house of business and had tea, and they said, "We would love to welcome you into our social circle, but you got to change your profession." Mary said, "No, I like what I do. I'm not going to change, but thank you for the offer. By the way, it's almost quitting time. Your husbands are probably about done upstairs. If you ladies just want to wait around, perhaps they'll come down and walk you home." Ben had become a big-time gambler now, and he had his fingers in horse racing and bootlegging all over town. He had 2 casinos downtown and one at Lake Manawa. The Manawa Casino had all the latest of the gambling equipment, and it was said the gamblers came from all over the region for 2 reasons. One, Ben was said to be on the square. You know, the house didn't always win. And also, the sky was the limit. And that would have been at 15 Pickard Lane in Manawa. It was destroyed in the 1913 Easter Sunday tornado. Then, Ben and Mary bought 1,000 acres just south of town. They built a 24-room ranch house, intentionally spanning the Mills and Pottawatomie County lines, just as a precaution in case one of the sheriffs would become particularly unfriendly. There was gambling downstairs, a brothel upstairs. The property held their pet elk and a 1-mile horse track. Now, it was said Ben was very kind-hearted, and he always saw to it that his guests had a ride home, even if they no longer owned the horses that they came on. Now, Ben was considered a shrewd judge of horses, land, and men. But he did make one mistake. He hired this guy. Ben's health was on the slide, and he involved John Mayberry to take over the gambling operations. Well, John was not an honest gambler. He relocated here from Webb City, Missouri to take advantage of Council Bluffs' vast rail network. Now, this was the beginning of a whole new strategy called the Big Store Con. Now, if you're old enough to remember a movie called The Sting, that was a big store con. And a lot of that strategy was developed by this guy right here in Council Bluffs. Now, it required a lot of people, took a lot of time, but the payoff could be huge. In fact, Mayberry named his operation the Millionaires Club. Now, he had a network of Confederates who rode the trains all throughout the region, and they were keeping an eye out for men with money who wanted to gamble high stakes. Minimum bet was $2,000, awful lot of money at the turn of the century. He directed them to Council Bluffs for a sure thing, and it was a sure thing. It was a sure thing that the house would always win because these games were fixed. The primary games were boxing, foot racing, and horse racing, I think probably because they were easy to fix. A typical scam would be a horse race. So the guys that come down, and these are smart people, and they'd watch for a little bit first. And after they watched a couple of races, they would see that clearly one of these horses is indeed better. So they would put down big bucks on that horse. And sure enough, that horse took right off. But he just got to the corner, and the jockey flew off, and he landed on the ground, and blood, almost ketchup, squirted from his mouth as the gamblers ran over and said, "Oh my gosh, he's dead. You guys better get out of here before the law comes." Well, now these generally were well-known businessmen, and the last thing they wanted to do was get involved in an illegal horse race in which a guy actually died. So they hightailed it out of there very quickly, leaving their money behind. This was a big operation. It operated out of the Merriam building. That sat where City Hall is today. And they accepted bets by mail, Post Office Box 4. The whole thing unraveled when a jockey really was killed, not from falling off a horse. He was shot because he refused to throw the race. So it ended up with a massive federal indictment. 1909, 84 people, including Ben Marks. He was the only local. He no longer was running the place, but he still owned it. And so they were all indicted for this. I would say then Mayberry was probably the richest guy we've ever had at the Squirrel Cage Jail downtown. All of them ended up doing quite a bit of time for this, with the exception of Ben Marks, and he was found innocent. Washington Post headline was, Council Bluffs, home of the biggest swindles on record in the United States. Though most of the time these activities, these fringe activities, operated in full view, there were periodic crackdowns, either real or for show. The Keels Hotel, for example, had a tunnel leading to a house of ill repute behind it on Fort Street, so that even if the sheriff was in a bad mood, guests could still take advantage of all of the amenities they had to offer. And when the city was pressured to enact a law closing saloons on Sundays, the proprietors complied by locking the front door and leaving the back door slightly ajar. In 1873, saloon keepers were asked to push their fighting customers out the back door instead of the front one because it was felt it would help clean up the city's Main Street image and also protect passerbys. This followed an incident at Linder's Saloon when an ejected man nearly hit a lady passing by on the sidewalk. Now, she dodged in time, but her ears were rudely assailed by the vile oaths used by the scrimmaging parties. Now, honestly, if one looks at the history of the Western frontier and you separate out the hype and the myths, I think the movies, the books, and the television shows have gotten it wrong. The reality is, those rough frontiersmen weren't playing poker in Dodge City surrounded by sagebrush. They were playing faro in a saloon surrounded by the Luss Hills on Broadway. Ladies and gentlemen, I submit to you that the wild western frontier wasn't in Kansas or Wyoming or Colorado. It was right here in Council Bluffs. So how did Hollywood get it so wrong? All a matter of timing. Dodge City became the cultural metaphor for the Old West. But Dodge City wasn't even created until 1872. 1872, that's over 20 years after the real frontier times were taking place right here in Council Bluffs. In fact, I'm going to say by 1872, the Wild West was gone. Things had become civilized. Now, by this time, there were the genteel writers like Bret Harte and Horace Greeley and Mark Twain, and the reporters from out east riding their comfortable trains out to the west so they could report back on this western frontier. But the frontier was gone. Now, in fairness, Dodge City did have a couple of bad months when they started in 1872. A couple of bad months. I mean, we had a couple of bad decades. Come on, give me a break. But anyway, they did have a couple of bad months in 1872. And the newspapers and writers zoomed all over that. They interwove the myths with the West, and well-publicized anarchy sold papers back east, let's face it. And the reality is no violent deaths, not a single one, occurred in Dodge City after that first 2 months for the next 2 years. But if you read the writings that were coming out of the West from these writers, the population, if you will, of Boot Hill Cemetery went from 11 to as high as 300 without a single new grave being dug. Hollywood discovered them in 1914, and the rest is history. Now, I mentioned it was faro, not poker, that was the game of the West. Well, so why can't I go to Harrah's or Horseshoe or Ameristar today and play faro? Well, for no other reason, it's been outlawed by the government. But even before that, it was too risky for a legitimate casino because conceivably one could win or lose everything on the toss of a single card. And that's pretty risky for a legitimate house. The other option was to rig the game, which is what our early saloons did. And that's not a good plan for a legitimate operation. The other card game that made us was three-card Monte. That's what cleaned out Mr. Studebaker. That's what was played all over town. You know, we should devote a couple of minutes to three-card Monte since it was such a big part of our history. Adam, you don't happen to have a deck of cards on you, and maybe some money. I could tell you what. I'll be the house and you can be the victim, okay? And we'll but the house always wins. Hey, I'm a retiree on a fixed income, okay? A little extra dough. Adam, you know, wait just a minute. We better not, I just got thinking, this great place finally opened. It'd be just my luck to get us busted. The place gets closed down because Adam and I are in an illegal card game. Let's just do the video instead. Okay, it's very simple. You watch that ace, and you know, it looks like that dealer's moving fast, but if you're really careful and you keep an eye on it, it's in the middle. Just watch, it's in the middle. It's in the middle. Oh, I should have bet Adam. Now let's watch again. It's on the bottom. You got to watch very carefully. Don't get confused, but it can be done, ladies and gentlemen. It's on the right. It's on the right. Oh, I am so good. So now at this time, after I've watched, my money would be on the table. I'm going to win big. I don't need to go to California because, these guys are fast. My eyes are faster. But the reason the house always wins in three-card Monte is because it's not a game. It's a card trick. When the dealer is showing off and nobody's actually gambling, notice how the ace is thrown off the bottom. Watch that again. It's thrown off the bottom. But once you put your money down and you're all excited, the ace now is thrown off the top. I got a deck of cards out at home and I was trying to practice. Bad and really would have beat me. The cards went all over the place, but these guys were really good and it worked. This made Council Bluffs what it is today, I'm sure. Okay, it's oft said that truth is stranger than fiction. And I believe that. But every now and then, a story will come along where I think, no, you're messing with me. Even in Council Bluffs, this can't have happened. Not even here. If you can't read the screen, it says wherever Meyer Lansky was, dead bodies turned up. A grand total of 43. So what was he doing on the streets of Council Bluffs? So let's fill in the backstory. This is one of those stories that really did happen, as improbable as it seems. Meyer Lansky grew up on the Lower East Side of New York City. He was a short fellow, but a tough little guy. He was the leader of a street gang that included Bugsy Siegel and Lucky Luciano, and they all became really good friends. Their gang evolved into what was known as Murder Incorporated, or they simply called it Murder Inc. That's really what they called it. And they found work becoming the enforcement arm of New York organized crime. They also were into the bootleg liquor business, but at the end of Prohibition, that necessitated a career change, so they moved into gambling. Siegel and Lansky bought the Flamingo Hotel in Las Vegas. Bugsy Siegel went out to run it, and Lansky involved himself in gambling operations in New York, Florida, and Havana. Meanwhile, back in Council Bluffs, the Great Depression hit agriculture hard, and that in turn impacted the railroads. And that's our two big industries. 25% of Council Bluffs worked for the railroads, and many, many more were employed in agriculture. So even though the whole country is affected by the Great Depression, Council Bluffs was hammered more so because of all of our eggs kind of in those two economic baskets. So how bad was it? It was bad. I found this picture out of the 1930s, and I think it sums it up. However, I found that in the family album, and I do want to apologize to my great aunt Irene for using that photo. But ladies and gentlemen, there's a life lesson here. Next time somebody points a camera at you and you are tempted to stick out your tongue, remember, some screwball relative may dig it out of the family album 90 years down the road and throw it up on the big screen. Just remember that. Now, city coffers were tapped. The city had to borrow money to pay expenses. How bad was it? Well, for one thing, City Hall was falling over, and there was no money to replace it. But city leaders had a plan. We're going to host a giant celebration. We are going to host a territorial centennial for the state of Iowa. Had all of these buildings built down at Dodge Park and hosted it over a period of several months. So how much money did we make on this? Well, none. We actually lost money. It didn't work. And so now we're really in debt and the creditors are getting ugly. So what do we do? I mean, what else does the city do? Raise taxes. But remember, this is the Great Depression. People are taxed. The delinquent tax list in the Daily Nopperell is already running 24 pages. Okay, now think about this for a second. And this is the part that I find a stretch. I would absolutely love to have been a fly on the wall at the meeting in town when somebody raised their hand and said, hey guys, I got an idea. Organized crime is pretty good about making money. I mean, you don't see Al Capone running around in rags. Why don't we contact them? I mean, who would think of such a thing? Who would suggest such a thing? And who would believe it? I mean, that would be like Mayor Walsh walking to the next city council meeting and say, this COVID thing has really got us kind of strapped, guys, but I got an idea. This Bernie Madoff guy, I hear he's really a good fundraiser. When he gets out of jail, or maybe we could get him paroled or transferred to the Council Bluffs jail, he might have some fundraising ideas. I mean, who would even take this seriously? But the weird thing is, it happened. In May 1941, Meyer Lansky, the alleged boss of the underworld, the man that Reader's Digest had proclaimed to be public enemy #1, signed a contract with the Council Bluffs Park Board offering to pay the city $1,000 in rent weekly for the privilege of operating greyhound racing at the Dodge Park Fairgrounds, which is where Playland Park is now. Or Playland Park was in my time. Okay, oh well, whatever. Now there's one minor issue. Okay, one slight flaw in the ointment here, one problem with the plan: dog racing isn't legal in the state of Iowa, okay? But Meyer Lansky had an idea. He said, he looked at the Iowa code. There's absolutely nothing in the Iowa code that prohibits you from owning a dog. Now, and to make it convenient, the track will even sell you a dog. And your dog can run the race. And if your dog wins the race, well, obviously, he's a popular dog. He will go up in value. You can sell him back to the track and make a profit. So here we have an officially sanctioned betting in a state where betting was officially illegal. Not only did the city not mind, they organized it. Did it work? You bet it did. It worked like a charm. Council Bluffs was out of debt in they were trying to get out of debt within 3 years. They were out of debt in less than 6 months. And not only did we not raise taxes, we lowered them. Probably the only city in the United States in the Great Depression that lowered taxes. It worked like a charm. A true win-win-win situation. Meyer Lansky made money, Council Bluffs made a lot of money, and the patrons were happy. And no dead bodies, not a one. A police official commented they had a very clean operation. The races were real, not fixed. Another detective said, when I knew him, you couldn't ask for a nicer fellow. This operation went on for nearly 6 years. Now, considering Lansky's connections in other businesses, why did he come to Council Bluffs? We know it's great, but probably a fairly small town compared to Miami, New York, and Havana where he was dealing, and I do not know the answer to that. I'm thinking maybe he was keeping a low profile when the feds were investigating his connection to Murder Inc. back east. I don't know, but for whatever reason, it happened, and as odd as it was, it worked for all involved. But I still get hung up on the logistics. Do mobsters have listed telephone numbers? What do you do, dial director assistants? Can I have the mafia, please? No. How about try Murder Inc.? Maybe they're listed. There has to be more to this story here that I'd love to hear someday. Well, Preserve Council Bluffs has a dining and historic home event every year. Well, not this year. It was canceled because of the pandemic. But one of the houses we used last year used to be a restaurant, Rainbow Gardens, up in the hills there by Big Lake Park. Beautiful view. And then asked me to look into a little bit of the history, just to give folks who are going to dine there some background. And I saw this ad, and for some reason it struck me as odd. Something about it seemed odd, a nice place for nice people. I like Longhorn Steakhouse. I guess when I go there, I just assume they're nice people. I've yet to see Olive Garden say, come on down to Olive Garden, we're nice people. It just seems strange. So I dug a little deeper, and sure enough, I'm thinking things weren't as innocent as it seemed. I think Mrs. Long had a little spin doctoring going on, trying to counter a growing bad reputation. But it wasn't just Rainbow Gardens. From the late 1930s into the 1950s, South Omaha Bridge Road became a hotspot for upscale entertainment, spirits, and high-stakes gambling. Never mind the 2 out of 3 were illegal, but it flourished openly just outside the city limits for many, many years. Now, I haven't mentioned this lady yet, and honestly, she doesn't really belong in this program, but I kind of teased it when I did the show a couple of weeks ago here, and in case any of the same folks are here, I did say I'd talk about it, and it's a good story, so let's toss it in here. May was the 100th anniversary of Council Bluffs' most priceless treasure, maybe one of the most priceless treasures in all of Iowa, and that's the Ruth Ann Dodge Memorial, which to we locals is, of course, the Black Angel. It was created by Daniel Chester French, known for many prominent works, most notably the big seated Lincoln at the Lincoln Memorial in Washington, D.C., and the Minuteman in Concord, Massachusetts. But let's go back a few years earlier. When General Dodge passed away in 1916, tens of thousands of people turned out to pay their respects. His funeral, even though it was a bitterly cold January day, his funeral was the biggest funeral procession in Iowa history. Now, a few years later, when Mrs. Dodge passed away, the Dodge daughters wanted to do something special for their mother. So they decided, we'll get a sculpture. And when that sculpture is done, we'll have a huge dedication to rival this number of people. It's Mom's turn to be celebrated this time. But they didn't do it. They got the sculpture, but instead they scrapped the plan and had an unannounced, private, on-the-secret ceremony with only the Dodge family present. What happened? Have you ever given any thought as to who the model for the Black Angel is? I never had. Well, apparently the Dodge daughters didn't either, and they were livid when they learned it was Audrey Monroe, the first woman ever to appear completely naked in an American film. What an embarrassment. They could just see those people. Oh, instead of honoring Mom, they'll be just snickering, oh, she looks a lot different with those robes on. This is horrible. Yeah. Things couldn't get any worse. Don't ever say that, because things got worse. Honestly, I think they could have pulled this off. There weren't that many people seeing Audrey Munson's films. I think it would have slid by. However, Audrey ended up doing something that suddenly got her on the front page of every newspaper in the United States. According to the media hype, she had a boyfriend. Well, he wasn't really a boy. He was 37 years older, but he was a rich doctor in New York, and he had an apartment that he owned, and he let her stay there for free. Everything was fine, except Doc's wife not too cool on the arrangement, so she told Audrey she had to move out. She evicted her. Well, next morning, Doc's wife is dead with an imprint of a lead pipe on her noggin. And Audrey is nowhere to be found. Not in the city, not in the state, not even in the entire country. Well, of course, the media loves things like this. So she was on the front page of every paper in the country for weeks. She actually was found eventually and ended up spending the last 64 years of her life in an insane asylum. But rather than risk she lived to be 104, rather than risk the humiliation of having somebody in that crowd of thousands that they hope to attract, looking up at that statue, nudging their neighbor, that face looks familiar. Can you place that? Well, it looks like that insane homicidal porn star. It's been all over the papers. They dropped the public dedication entirely. However, the Dodge sisters were really good at keeping a secret, because as much as I like poking around and reading Council Bluffs history, I absolutely had never heard an inkling of this until less than a year ago. There's a gentleman out there, Robert Swasina is his name. He doesn't live locally. I think he lives in Minnesota, and he has done a lot of research into Audrey Munson, and he sent us his information, and the Dodge House and Library actually were planning to bring him to town to talk about that. Actually, it's been scheduled twice, but canceled because of the pandemic, but keep your eyes open, because that'll be a really good program. Okay, so how did Council Bluffs become the domicile of depravity anyway? Well, I blame these guys. Wait, you snicker. You say, wait, the Mormons? Well, they're a pious, hard-working lot that detested idleness and drunkenness? They sure were, and therein lies the problem. Their sound thinking and planning went into creation of this town. To facilitate the migration of the saints to the Promised Land, which they knew would take years, they actually built a real town, a stable, functioning town, and advertised it as such. This provided a great infrastructure for all westbound pioneers. Most other frontier towns were haphazard and disorganized. And I would say early on, people were headed west from all sorts of places. But by the 1860s, I'd say virtually all wagon trains were coming through Council Bluffs, attracting a rough and tumble crowd. would-be gold miners were a tough lot. And some of those headed west were doing so to escape trouble they'd already gotten into back east. But that's not the worst thing the Mormons did. They up and moved. Our population dropped from 7,000 to 2,000 in a short period of time. 5,000 went west. And with that, the church ended up retaining squatters' rights on all that land, meaning it could not be assessed a property tax. How do cities get their money for city services? A property tax. So we elected the mayor in 1853, Cornelius Voris, and I think he really did try and continue that tight ship the Mormons started. He created the position of city marshal, but had no money for the salary. He only had $280 to run the entire town. That wasn't much to run a town, even back in 1853. So Mayor Voris resigned in frustration. So essentially, there was no government, no law enforcement for 2 years. And so I would say those were the biggest things that started us spiraling toward that sinkhole of sin. But what do we do about it? How do we get out of this mess? Well, let's take stock of our resources. What do we have? Well, we got a jail. Well, what good is that going to do? Locking people up, then we'd have to feed them. We don't have any money. But wait, how about if we just threaten them a little bit with the jail? But we can't just threaten anybody. We've got to go after people that have a way to earn big bucks. So, how about once a month, we'll round up our ladies of negotiable virtue and assess a $50 fine. If they pay up, great. If they don't have it, I suppose we can lock them up during the day if we have to, but then we'll let them out at night so they can go back to their place of business and earn the money to pay their monthly fine. And we'll do it every month. Did this work? You bet it did. Finding the city's sporting women and licensing saloons probably saved Council Bluffs and kept it alive. Now, the newspapers were opposed to this, but not for the reason you're probably thinking. They called these fines blackmail. Blackmail of women, quote, engaged in business that is a necessary adjunct of the prosperity as a city. So interesting how the profession was accepted. Now, the society women looked down on these ladies, but it seemed like it was more the way a snooty person would look down on somebody today that thought was beneath their stature. Oh, she's only a truck stop waitress or something like that. It just seemed to have a lot more acceptance than I would have ever believed. Another thing contributing to our unsavory reputation, railroads. Council Bluffs was announced as the eastern terminus in 1862, and our population increased 400% in just 5 years. So this provided an endless stream of transient strangers who are great prospects for those of evil intent. The victims were just passing through. Before they could cause too much fuss, they were on another train out of here, albeit somewhat less financially off than when they arrived. Now you said, well, thanks to the money from the brothels, we now had a police force. Where were these guys? What were they doing? Well, interesting enough, as long as no locals were hassled, strangers passing through were considered fair game. Now, that sounds a little crass, but the attitude of the time was that it serves the victims right. One of the policemen said, quote, "The shenanigans only succeed because of the fundamental dishonesty of their victims wanting something for nothing," unquote. Now, some of the attitude may have come from the top. Keep in mind, at that time, of course, no elected officials were actually born here. They all had to come into town, and the system was entrenched when they arrived. So the perception was, well, this is just how we do things in Council Bluffs. Also, breaking up the system would likely raise taxes. Never a popular way for an elected official to remain in position. Now, a little later on, I think Iowa laws probably encouraged violation. Remember, we were talking about the Rainbow Gardens earlier. And when I was researching that information, I was constantly finding these news stories about how the sheriff is going in and raiding these bars and coming out with all of this liquor. And I didn't get it. This is a bar, dude. That's what they do. It'd be like raiding Menards and finding they have lumber. You're surprised? I mean, I don't get it. And no, it wasn't Prohibition. That ended in 1933. These news stories are coming out of the late 30s, 40s, and 50s. So what's up? Well, what was up was my lack of knowledge of Iowa liquor laws. Between the end of Prohibition in 1933 and 1963, so 30 years, a tavern in Iowa could only sell beer, no other liquor. Now, you could buy liquor to drink at home, but at one place only, the state-owned liquor store at 33 South Main Street. Now, eventually we had a second state-owned liquor store, but the state still owned all the liquor stores all the way until 1987. So I think some of these quirks in the Iowa law might have contributed to the temptation toward illegal operations. Other ways Iowa laws may have perpetuated our gritty image is because for a long time, our bars were open 1 hour later than Omaha, and our drinking age was 1 hour lower. The notorious Joker Lounge, there at 36th and Broadway, I think developed that reputation because it was the closest Iowa bar to Nebraska. Now, the reason it's all up in smoke there is because that's the only picture I could find of this Council Bluffs class. It's the only photo I could find. Some joker popped a Molotov cocktail into it in February 1977, and that's what that photo of is. But they did reopen, stayed in business until 1985, and then it became Fat Jack's after that. So by the 1970s, we had a city that looked like it hadn't kept pace with the times, and the most visual businesses on Broadway were adult bookstores, strip clubs, and adult movie theaters. Now, this made it hard for the city to appear vibrant and attract new business and families. Now, this all contributes to a cycle. Our image as the gritty city attracted more of the same. Now, in the 1970s, we tried to aggressively promote civic pride. We started Pride Week. We started a We Take Pride parade. We had Pride Park downtown. We had bumper stickers. We even had a jingle. We take pride, Council Bluffs. But after 150 years, the reputation had become entrenched. It fostered the notion that Council Bluffs is just that kind of town. Hence, Barb's father ordering his daughter, don't ever go to Council Bluffs. Now, how do you shake that? Well, in the 1970s, Mayor Ron Cleveland suggested parimutuel betting with a dog trap, but legal this time. 1% of the revenue would go to the city. Look what Exarban had done for Omaha with its horse racing over the years. And of course, that brings us into modern times. That started a whole chain of events that has altered our direction profoundly. And of course, that's a topic of a whole different program. But it is interesting to think that in an incredibly ironic twist, our being the gritty frontier town led to this artistic renaissance we're experiencing today. Because had we been just an average town, we probably wouldn't have hit that rock bottom in the 1970s that was motivated by us being a sinkhole of sin, and that in turn motivated the aggressive moves that led to all of this. Now, when I say this is just not just a cool venue, it's a whole concept. If you don't mind, let me just explain for just a moment. I was on the nominating committee of the Historical Society a few years ago, and there was a lady who I thought was fairly active in civic affairs, so I asked her if she'd be on our board of directors, and she turned me down. But she did say, I got some advice for the Historical Society, though. She said, your organization and other small groups like it don't grow because you aren't really part of the community. You're on the periphery. You are a niche. You do what you do well, but to grow, you need to integrate with the community. Okay, makes sense, but I didn't know how to do it. Last fall, Dana, the CEO of this place, was taking me on a tour through here. We got to wear hard hats and everything. It wasn't done yet. And as we're walking along, she's rattling off all these ideas and pointing things out. You know, like if you did a program, for example, cross-pollination, she called it. We got to cross-pollinate. You could do a program maybe on Council Bluffs restaurants, and we could have a pop-up kitchen serving some of those foods, and maybe upstairs we could have the cooking class doing some of these things. Oh, maybe this is what the integration was all about. And then when Adam took me through a few weeks ago, he said, you know, art and history, they go together. We want to address them both. So I'd say this is not just a venue, it's a whole new approach for Council Bluffs. And I think it's very exciting. So thanks for having me. Let's do, in our last 20 seconds, let's go back 45 years and dig out that cool jingle about Council Bluffs. And if you want to sing along, go for it. Sing out your pride for our fine city.
A dream come true, a dream come Council Bluffs. There's so much to love, to be so proud of. We take pride in Council Bluffs. We take pride in Council Bluffs.
So we're going to go upstairs in a little bit. I think, is there a little intermission first? And I'll be upstairs to answer any questions. Maybe a couple of things we can look at on some of the pictures up there. But thanks for coming tonight.